Let's flash back to 2018. It's a comically hot afternoon, and I'm sitting in an airplane hangar at the Black Ops 4 community reveal surrounded by a ton of equally excited Call of Duty fanboys when Jason Bodybuilder Blundell himself takes to the stage to talk zombies. The chaos stuff didn't really do much for me in the moment, but seeing the camera pan up in that teaser to reveal the Primus crew in Alcatraz made me giddy for the next few days. Now let's jump to later on in the year. Black Ops 4 launched and I was so disappointed. The game barely functioned, which was bad enough, but the map that I had been so unbelievably excited about for months turned out to be less than I was hoping for. But how does the map stand up 2 years later? Was the hate warranted? Or, like Voyage of Despair, was I perhaps just a bit too hard on it? Well, without further delay, welcome to Blood of the Dead. That intro is a bit cheesier than normal. So, let's start off with the good, and where more fitting to begin than the very beginning. Taking place seconds after the death of Takeo Misaki seen in Zetsubo Nishima, Richtofen teleports Primus to the ever-familiar Alcatraz prison. We as the audience expect this to go as we've already seen in the comics, but things immediately feel a bit off. The crew ends up nowhere near Richtofen's lab, whereas in the comic, they arrived right outside of it. But, just like Richtofen, we brush it off as nothing. After journeying through the prison, they finally come across Richtofen's lab and yet another Richtofen. Side note, can we just talk about Takeo's reaction in the background? I have never related to a character more than I have in this moment. It's better not to think about it too hard, Tech, just go with it. It's here that the timeline truly diverges from what we know. As he leaves through a portal, Richtofen 2 tells our Richtofen to reread the Chronorium, which immediately sends him into a frightened gamer fit. You son of a bitch! As our heroes quickly attempt to flee the prison, the Warden of Alcatraz emerges from his office and destroys their portal, leaving them trapped in this hellish pocket dimension. What follows is a pretty awesome chase scene through the island, which ends with our heroes being cornered at the docks, and a nice visual callback to Mob's opening. I adore this intro. Regardless of what I have to say later story-wise, this is a hell of an opening that instantly gets you invested in the mysterious adventure to come. And as soon as that intro ends, we arrive at my next point, the early game setup. Unlike many other Treyarch endeavors, Blood of the Dead takes a page out of the Sledgehammer book and opts for a significantly more cinematic approach to its progression. But the part that I really want to highlight is the catwalk rush. As soon as you open that gate, an alarm sounds, turning the entire island's gaze upon the player. As you attempt to rush your way through the narrow hallways, groups of zombies will appear and attack you. After finally roughing it through the catwalk itself, the Warden of Alcatraz appears and rallies the inmates of the prison.
Alcatraz! Rise and greet our guest properly!
Before disappearing, he destroys a sizable chunk of the prison wall, completely knocking out the power you just turned on. But of course, there's no time to focus on that, as the zombies and hellhounds are going to be on you in seconds. All that you can do now is push forward and make your way towards the prison entrance. Once you make it inside and things have calmed down a bit, you're greeted to a familiar sight, the spawn room of Mob of the Dead. Accompanying this reunion is a reprise of that map's hauntingly beautiful load screen music, which incites a wonderful sense of nostalgia. It's like the map itself is saying, "Welcome back, old friend." This entire sequence is unlike anything we've ever seen before from Aether, and I simply love it. Everything is so well executed here. The constantly escalating tension as you make your way through the hordes, and to have it punctuated by such a wonderfully nostalgic welcome back is just nothing short of incredible. This cinematic approach applies to much of the map's main quest as well, which features multiple mid-match IGCs and scripted moments that feel straight out of a movie. The most effective example has to be during the map's final battle, where Richtofen finally gives into the will of the Chronorium and enters the dark mechanism. Big Chungus then reappears with a shit ton of reinforcements, and just as all seems lost, we cut back to the cryopod in the lab, or at least the player playing as Richtofen does, which has finally finished defrosting Primus Richtofen.
Yo, what's up?
As the Warden threatens to overwhelm our heroes, the Edsickle hurries his way onto the scene and uses the power of the Firestaff's crystal to cleanse the land, finally putting down the Warden and setting the souls of Alcatraz free from the purgatorial dimension. Now, in terms of writing, There is so much wrong here, and I will certainly get into that later, but from a purely cinematic standpoint, this whole last act, which I'd categorize as from here to here, is phenomenal. The pacing and expertise of each cinematic moment and new reveal is so well executed that even though I know the writing is pretty questionable, I still can't help but get into it every single time. Well, now that I've gotten the early game and general cinematic approach out of the way, let's talk map design. Rather than opting for a one-for-one remake like Chronicles, Treyarch decided to expand on the old layout by creating new play spaces for the player. There's a lot I have to critique about this map design, especially the removal of the Golden Gate Bridge. Like, come on man, why would you do that? But any area that was created specifically for this map is actually very well designed and fun to play in. This includes the West Grounds, which consists of Richtofen's lab, the powerhouse, and new industries, and the other two areas, the Warden's house and the recreation yard. The Warden's house is a close quarters nightmare with an awesome holdout spot, for those of you that are into that kind of thing. And the northern section of the island has a pretty solid gameplay flow. Honestly, that's probably my favorite part of the entire map because of how varied it is. Let's say you want to kite an entire horde around safely. You can do that pretty effectively near the Pog 12 wallby, or maybe you just want to run around the entire area. Well, this is a viable strategy as well, as each area loops into one another very well. But if you're a complete nutjob and want your blood pressure to rise to a dangerous level, grab a couple of your friends and try holding out in Richtofen's lab. Yeah, this is fine. As for the map's weapons, much like the map design itself, Blood of the Dead aims to take the old and inject it with a little bit of new. The Blundergat, Acid Gat, Hell's Retriever, and Redeemer all return from Mob of the Dead relatively unchanged. The Golden Spork returns as well, with a new way of acquisition, and furthermore can be upgraded 2 more times, once into the Golden Scalpel, and one final time into the Golden Shiv. Side note, I'm not the biggest fan of the perk Ethereal Razor, but this, and maybe Alpha Omega, are the only maps in the game that can really make this perk work. I'm telling you, you haven't truly gamed until you've combined the Golden Spork with Ethereal Razor.
Yeah? Pretty sure that's a neurotoxin. Oh well.
The quests for these weapons, on their own, are relatively straightforward, but to obtain anything past the Spork, you have to have the Hell's Redeemer, which, oh my god, that side quest is an absolute nightmare. Yeah, running around literally the entire map, pressing left trigger every 2 seconds to search for a ghost pup is really fun. The fuck were you thinking? Alongside the returning classics, Blood of the Dead also features 2 completely new weapons, a lava-infused Blundergat variant, the Magma Gat, and a new zombie shield, the thematically appropriate Spectral Shield. This thing is probably one of my favorite utilities in zombies. The design of it is amazing and fits right at home with the original. And from a practical point of view, it's an incredibly versatile piece of equipment. It can still be used to protect yourself from incoming attacks, of course, but by looking through the window of the shield, you're able to see into the spectral plane. This allows you to see things that you normally wouldn't be able to. For example, the skulls needed for the free Blundergat side quest. You can also use the spectral blasts to enter various codes into the Citadel number pad, or open locked cells to obtain free power-ups. In addition to its tactical applications, it can be used for offense as well. After using the Warden's key to suck up a few souls, you can unleash a spectral blast that instantly kills all enemies in front of you. Barring the Warden, of course. I still love the Ballistic Shield and Apollo's Will, but in terms of raw killing power and general versatility, the Spectral Shield has them both beat by a country mile. It protect, but it also attack. And if you don't want to spend the time sucking up zombie souls for the blast, well, maybe you should learn some patience. You can go up to one of the kill switches around the map, and, should it be sparking, interacting with it while holding out your shield will instantly refill your blasts. This is easily my favorite of the zombie shields to date. As for the Magma Gat, while cool in concept, and honestly pretty effective in execution, it really isn't a weapon that I enjoy using. The main issue I have with it is that its distraction effect is so ludicrously inconsistent. Sometimes it feels like the zombies will prioritize chasing the projectile when I'm clearly much closer to them, and just as often, they'll run right through it and continue chasing me. I'm the kind of player that relies heavily on the consistency of my equipment to make split-second decisions, because I personally find that style of play much more thrilling than running zombies around in a circle. The Magma Gat is great for that, but for the way I play, and I know I'm gonna get a ton of shit for this, the Acid Gat is so much better.
The fuck you say?
Even though its killing power is inferior to the Magma Gats, its distraction effect is remarkably consistent. As long as you have PhD, it's really hard to die with this thing. But I'll admit, the Magma Gat is really good at putting down the Warden. With the map's gameplay covered, let's talk story. The first thing I want to talk about is the continuation of Mob of the Dead. I want to say right off the bat that I'm not the hugest fan of continuing Mob of the Dead's story in the first place. I much prefer the idea of keeping the ending open-ended and player determined. But they did it anyway, so let's set that bias aside and give it a genuine chance. I'll be honest, a lot of it is really rough, but I really liked how they wrapped up the story of the mobsters. We're not really told exactly what happened after the events of Mob of the Dead. Instead, we have to piece it together using clues found around the map, character dialogue, and the main quest. So with all that, here's what I'm fairly certain happened, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. Alright, story time. After continuously failing to escape the pocket dimension during the cycle of New Year's 1933, Arlington, with the protection of the zombified inmates, is finally able to hold off and kill the other mobsters on the bridge, breaking the cycle and allowing time to continue as normal in that dimension. Billy, Sal, and Finn's spirits manifest as prisoners once again, but Arlington's spirit takes the form of a seagull, allowing him to freely roam the island. Over the next 7 years, due to his knowledge gained from the numerous cycles he's endured, the mobsters and the remaining souls of Alcatraz eventually came to see Arlington as a leader of sorts. So now, under new leadership, all that was left to do was to wait. Wait for the day that someone would come to defeat the Warden and set all of them free. This leads us directly into the events of Blood of the Dead, which ultimately sees the spirits of the prison turning on the Warden under Arlington's leadership to aid Primus in their journey. This part of the story is actually pretty great. It feels like a natural continuation of Mob's story and reveals a few new elements of its world to the audience, while at the same time not completely gutting the mystery of the island itself. That part comes later, so before we get into this talking point, I want to be 100% honest. I'm nowhere near as learned regarding the ins and outs of music as I am with, let's say, cinematography, so I won't be able to analyze it as professionally as I would like to. Instead, I'd like to talk about the emotion that this soundtrack and its precursor elicit. Mob of the Dead was the first map to introduce full soundtracks to zombies. It's still probably my favorite in the series to this day, so Blood of the Dead has a lot to live up to in this regard. While I don't personally feel that it exceeds Mob of the Dead's, this map's soundtrack is nonetheless fantastic. Not only are a lot of the tunes really catchy and easy to jam out to, but they also feel tonally connected to the original's music. Mob of the Dead managed to capture a beautiful mix of fear and sadness through its music. Tracks like Underworld set an effectively spooky mood, whereas others, like the map's loading screen, reflected the more sad and hopeless tone of Arlington's character journey. Blood utilizes its soundtrack just as, if not arguably more effective than the original. The best example is the map's finale. After a grueling final battle with the Warden, which was set to what is arguably the best boss fight theme in zombies, we get another reprise of the loading screen song that started it all. But now, in the context of the map's story, its meaning is inversed. It's no longer a tune representing loss of hope. It's one of triumph and finality, as the souls of those that have been trapped for so long are finally set free. It may sound a bit sappy and... yeah, it totally is. But it's such a beautifully executed moment that puts a genuine smile on my face every time I watch this ending. But what's even more emotionally moving than this moment is what immediately follows it. A scene that has become quite famous in the community. The death of Edward Richtofen. Aside from Nolan North's incredible performance here, there's so many important things that line up just right to make this arguably the most emotionally impactful scene in the entire franchise. And I'm not just talking zombies, I'm talking campaign, all the other side modes, whatever. The most important of which was the decision to completely cut the music halfway through to just let the raw emotion of the scene play out. But let's address the elephant in the room, and that's the idea that because there's another Richtofen ready to join the crew, the impact of this death is completely negated. While I used to agree with that sentiment a while back, now I could not disagree more. The reason why this death is so tragic isn't simply because, oh no, Richtofen died. There's so much more to it than that. The tragedy comes from us playing through Black Ops 3 and knowing what could have happened. From the Richtofen Memories trailer, we can infer that his original plan was to simply use the blood vials on his uniform to survive Monty's plan and continue living. When he agreed to enact this plan, he didn't care about the others. They were merely tools to him. But throughout his journey across the multiverse, something changed, as evidenced by a quote in Revelations.
When I died, I felt nothing. When Dempsey died, I felt something. When Takeo died, I knew I had to try to save them.
This quote tells us that he had a change of heart and began to view Primus as more than just a means to an end. He started to see them as his friends and knew that he had to try to save them from what was coming. That's where the extra blood vials and this entire Alcatraz plan came in. Revelations also confirms that Richtofen is afraid. He's afraid of fading away into nothing. He's afraid of being forgotten. This Richtofen wanted nothing more than to save his friends and continue his own existence. Not as a child, not as Ultimus, but as himself. So now we come back to Blood of the Dead. Because Gorod, Revelations, and the Great War haven't happened yet in this cycle, Richtofen didn't have time to build a genuine friendship with the rest of the crew. Because of that, he dies alone and afraid. And as he draws his last breath, he realizes that the only people he considers friends will never even know how he truly feels about them. They will forget this version of him like he was nothing. That is the tragedy of Edward Richtofen, and why this ending still holds so much power to me. Sure, there's another one to replace him, but that's not the point. The point is understanding the sheer tragedy of this version of Richtofen, and empathizing with his fears. And in that respect, this is absolutely Craig Hewson's best writing to date. With the good out of the way, let's dive into what I'm fairly certain most of you tuned in for. What just does not work about this one? My biggest issue with Blood of the Dead by far is its overall map design and scale. If the writing of a map is bad, that's fine. As long as it's fun to play, I can get over it. Eventually. After all, Revelations is one of my favorite maps to play. But Blood of the Dead's map design suffers from the Origin syndrome, where it is just way too big, to the point that it often becomes a chore to navigate. I think that's entirely because of the choice to add new areas onto the old design. Yes, I did praise these new areas earlier on, and I stand by that. On their own, they're great, but in the context of the overall map design, these new additions simply make the map way too big. Basically, Blood of the Dead wants to have its cake and eat it too. It wants to be a faithful recreation of the original, but at the same time, reimagine it. Instead of making an already massive map even bigger, I think that the better move would have been to compress and consolidate. What I mean by this is add the new areas by all means, but get rid of some areas as well and redistribute the now scrapped areas' utilities to the new areas. If you were to cut out an area to help consolidate things a bit, I think completely scrapping the dock section of the map would have been a good move because, let's be honest, besides a quest step or two and obtaining the spoon, what reason is there to travel down there after your initial setup? If you're drawing a blank, don't worry, that's the correct answer. There is no reason to go down here, ever. In Mob of the Dead, if you wanted to craft all the buildables, you had to utilize the workbench down there as there were only 2 of them. But in Blood, this is no longer required. Instead, you can just go to the new workbench in the West Grounds. I honestly think the only reason they changed the location of the spoon is that someone realized during development, oh shit, there's literally no reason for this entire segment to exist. Okay, we gotta put something down there. On top of this, and this is a problem with the map's flow in general, it isn't quickly accessible like the West Grounds. I've made this comparison before, but let's look at Voyage of Despair real quick. Even though both of these maps are massive, Voyage feels so much less oppressive to traverse because of how well placed its fast travels are. No matter where you are in the map, you're never too far away from one, but they're in pretty dangerous spots for the most part, usually right next to zombie spawn points. meaning that you have to commit to running to one. You can't waffle on that decision, because if you do, those few seconds of indecision will make zombies much more likely to get the jump on you. Blood of the Dead retains the latter point, what with the whole dangers and benefits thing, but what it doesn't share is Voyage's solid and numerous placements. The placement of Blood's fast travels are, for the most part, pretty worthless. They're largely out of the way, and there's nowhere near enough of them to help alleviate the sheer scale of the map. But I'd be remiss in not giving credit where it's due. The one in the cafeteria that leads to the powerhouse is actually pretty good. One last negative about the fast travels is that they're not really fast per se, especially the gondola, which is the only way to get to the docks, in air quotes, quickly. The gondola is a very slow utility, which was fine in Black Ops 2 because the pace of the game was much slower. But with the absurdly quick respawn speed of zombies in Black Ops 4, waiting for it to arrive and recharge mid-round is a death sentence. Oh, and if you use it mid-round from the docks, all the zombies respawn in front of you before you even get back to the prison. In what world is this fair? Have I mentioned that I dislike everything that has to do with the docks? To wrap up the map design, I just want to say that I'm of the mindset that any map size can work. But with the addition of these new areas, the sheer scale of this map, combined with the lack of well-placed fast travels, and of course, Black Ops 4's zombie respawn mechanics making otherwise well-designed areas utter nightmares, it's just too much. But even though I strongly dislike the general layout and flow of Blood, I can sympathize with the developers in this case. For context, in Black Ops 2, while developing Mob of the Dead, they reportedly mapped out the entirety of Alcatraz Island, but had to cut the playable areas down substantially because of the limitations of current-gen hardware. So I completely understand why, when finally given the chance to fully realize their original vision for the map, that they would go all out. Again, I sympathize with that. But sometimes it's better to not give in to that temptation. Sometimes, as that compromised layout we got back in 2013 proved, less is more. So I'm not a fan of the map's design and overall size. That's a given. But I could forgive it to an extent if those were its only gameplay flaws. Sadly, they're not. Another massive issue is the addition of roaming Pack-a-Punch. As I mentioned when covering Voyage of Despair, I hate this feature. Every time it appears in a map, I roll my eyes. But Blood of the Dead somehow takes a feature that already isn't good and makes it 10 times worse through one seemingly simple omniscient, and that's the omniscient of clues as to where the Pack-a-Punch actually is. For comparison, let's take Call of the Dead and Tag der Toten. While roaming Pack-a-Punch does exist, the blow is somewhat softened by the game literally shining a giant spotlight on the machine's current location, so you don't have to waste additional game time looking for it. Der Eisendrache in Voyage of Despair managed to one-up this by flat out telling you exactly where it is at any given time. But in Blood, there is literally zero indication as to where the machine is. This may not seem too horrible at first, but this tiny decision has a horrific trickle-down effect. By not telling the player where Pack is, you force them to traverse the entire map looking for it, and since the possible locations are so spread out, this can take a surprising amount of time in solo. The machine's movement is also round-based, so every time you want to Pack-a-Punch, you're forced to kill the game's pace stone dead and hold on to a single zombie while you traverse a map that is already very unfun to do so, making the simple task of upgrading a weapon a complete slog. And that's one of the most fun parts of zombies, upgrading your weapons and seeing your arsenal get more powerful. That's why wonder weapons, special equipment, wonder weapon upgrades, and all that even exist. It's a very satisfying progression, and Blood of the Dead somehow manages to screw up that very, very basic bit of progression. Speaking of slogs, the main quest. As I discussed earlier, the cinematic approach it takes, what with the multiple mid-match IGCs and scripted events, is really cool, but the actual quest steps range from to holy fuck. There's some that aren't so bad, like when you escort a ghostly inmate to salvation while his ghost pals cheer him on, but then there's steps like this, where you have to play Simon Says with these generators in the dark and then jot down some symbols. But hey, you better be sure to do it quickly, or else the light showing what symbols you need to jot down will go away and you're shit out of luck. Oh, and yeah, here's some more zombies on top of it, even though you strategically left only one alive at the end of the round.
Kind of day!
But more problematic than the specific steps, somehow is the overwhelming feeling of repetition that comes from this quest. As an example of what I'm talking about, early on in the quest, Arlington appears in bird form and, as he doesn't trust Primus yet, he steals the Chronorium. To get it back, you have to roam the entire map, check 40 possible spawn locations, and shoot Al with a Spirit Blast. You have to do this 4 times before you can even get the Chronorium back. That's not even the most repetitive part of the quest though. To initiate each of the island's trials, you have to go over to the Chronorium, look at the numbers on the page, get souls for a shield blast, and then enter said numbers into the Citadel number pad. Doesn't sound too bad, right? But then you realize that you have to do this exact same process 5 separate times minimum. If you fail a trial, you have to burn around and repeat the process. There's no shortage of terrible quests to choose from in Zombies, but this is the only one I absolutely refuse to do again. I did it twice for Remember Forever a year back, and once for this review, but no more. You can't make me. Moving on from gameplay, let's get back to the writing. Before release, Craig Houston said that he believed this map was his best script to date, which really made me hopeful. And he wasn't entirely wrong. As we discussed, there's some really great bits here, but they're few and far between and buried underneath mountains of nonsense. To start, there's numerous pointless retcons, like Brutus no longer being Stanley Ferguson. Instead, it's been changed that it was always the Warden and he was merely disguising himself as a guard to fuck with the mobsters. Okay, that's stupid and doesn't really make any sense, but fine, whatever. More egregiously is the amount of Deus Ex Machinas they managed to shove in here. As cool as it was initially to see Great War Richtofen come out of the cryopod, his entire existence in this map is nothing more than a half-ass way to wrap up every problem our heroes are currently facing with a neat little bow. While it was technically set up in a cipher all the way back in Der Eisendrache, I think it was, having Richtofen instantly wipe out everything evil with the Firestaff Crystal is such a narrative cheat that I genuinely cannot believe it. Not only is it narratively unsatisfying, but it robs the player's actions of any real meaning. As a player, you want your efforts to matter in the story, right? Let me draw some comparatives to previous zombie maps real quick, if what I'm saying isn't really all that clear. A good instance of your actions meaning something is Gorod Krovi. During the boss fight, sure, Nikolai exposes the dragon's weaknesses with his harpoons, but it's still the player's actions that kill it. The player is also the one to directly bring down Nikolai's mana core. A bad instance, and I hate to say it because of how much I adore the map, the Panzer Mortar in the Final Reich. While the player does attach the charge Uberschnalls to the monster, it ultimately ends up killing itself by attacking Richter's Zeppelin.
I'm gonna blow the walls off of this place. Going up!
We aren't the ones to deal the killing blow, and as a result, it's a lot less satisfying as a player. In maps like Gorod, your actions are the real important ones, and because of that, you feel accomplished. You killed that dragon. You brought down Nikolai. But with the Panzer Mortar and now the entirety of Alcatraz, some other outside force deals with the problem, and you're just left sitting there like, so I did all that work and I don't even get to kill it? Cool. They should have at least let us kill the big warden and then have Richtofen come in. It'd still be bullshit that he fixes everything in 5 seconds, but at least we would have had the satisfaction of finally putting down the warden once and for all ourselves. This last bit regarding the writing is purely for me, and may not even be something that bothers you in the slightest. But the biggest issue I have with Blood's writing is its need to explain everything about its world to the audience. For me, Mob of the Dead worked so well because even when you figured out the main story, when you think about it, you still didn't actually know a whole lot. Arlington was the audience's in-character, and even he didn't know exactly who is behind it or why they aren't allowed to stay dead. While it was pretty obvious by the writing on his walls that the warden probably had something to do with it, nothing was confirmed. This mystery applied to pretty much everything about the map and let the player's mind run wild with ideas. Was this the warden's fault? If it was the warden, did he know what would happen? Or was he simply meddling with powers that he didn't understand? Is he the one controlling the zombies? Why can't our characters die? Why is Weasel the only one to keep his memories after each cycle? Why is there even a cycle to begin with? Blood of the Dead throws all that intrigue right out the window and tells us, yeah, Alcatraz is a pocket dimension, and all of this is the Shadow Man's fault.
Salvatore De Luca, Finn O'Leary, Billy Handsome, Al Arlington. Their sins shall be their undoing. Their eternal punishment through your sacrifice will ensnare another.
So much is wrong here that I genuinely don't know where to start. What was once a uniquely mysterious and creepy chapter in the zombies universe has been reduced to nothing. Something I'd like to pull up here, and it's not a fair comparison at all, is David Lynch's approach to mystery and storytelling in general.
You know, I love mysteries like a book, but I don't like it when it ends and everything is sewn up 100%.
I agree with this take, and let me explain why. If you give the audience all the answers and wrap up every single loose end, you can kill the mysterious air of your story. Sure, the audience will have got their answers, but now there's no reason to keep a story and its world alive in your mind. This, sadly, applies to COD Zombies and the community itself. Have you noticed that ever since we got things like the Zombies timeline, people seem infinitely less interested in making theory videos or discussions on the lore? If you haven't noticed it, believe me, being around the community since 2010, there's a massive difference in audience hunger. Back in the World at War and Black Ops 1 days, because everything was so intentionally vague, you couldn't stop people from making theory videos and sharing their ideas with others. So let's wrap this up by applying this line of thinking to Mob of the Dead. If you go back and play that map today, you don't ask the same or really any questions anymore. That air of mystery is completely gone. Even though Mob is still my favorite map of all time, the way Blood utterly slaughters an aspect that I adored so much about it is genuinely a bit disheartening. So before we wrap up, let's lighten the mood a bit with my favorite segment, the Nitpicks. In third person, the sound of prepping the shield remains unchanged from the assault shield. If you crouch near this fence outside the warden's house, you can see the level geometry completely disappear. These little notes outside the warden's house don't actually have an alpha channel. It shouldn't be gray right there. That's supposed to be a torn piece of paper. Speaking of alphas, Marlton and Stuhlinger's glasses don't have the proper alpha channels on their lenses, resulting in completely solid lenses. While pack-a-punching, there's a chance you'll be greeted by the best typo in Zombies history.
Yeah, let's build your lab under Alcatraz. It's just a twisted little pocket dimension. What could go wrong? Fucking Illuminati.
Can we talk about this Pack-a-Punch camo for a second? It is so terrible. How can you go from one of the most iconic Zombies camos ever created to this uninspired Dreisendrach wannabe thing? I'm so happy Dark Matter overrides this. I really do love this map's intro, but this is the nitpick section, and boy are there plenty of inconsequential things to bitch about. Nikolai's eyes are now green, when they were blue in Black Ops 3, and still appear blue in the animated cutscenes of Alpha Omega and Tog der Toten. Dempsey's new face model looks nothing like the Dempsey we saw in Black Ops 2 and 3. In those games, his appearance is that of a gruff, conventionally handsome man, but in Black Ops 4, he looks like Brad Pitt, if he got stung by every bee. Dempsey and Richtofen's strifes sound amazing, but when they're fired, the slides don't actually move. That's not hard, guys, that's like 3 frames of animation data. When encountering the Warden, Richtofen's lip syncing is off. When Richtofen 2 walks towards the portal, you can see the portal's model disappear for a single frame. When Takio stabs the zombie in Building 64, the zombie's model completely changes between cuts. It goes from a prisoner to a guard. They're using the clean version of Primus's face textures again. These looked so bad in Black Ops 3 that they globally updated the character models to get rid of them shortly after Dreisendrach released. So, why did they do it again? So, in conclusion, my general stance on the map hasn't really changed all that much. It's still not one that I really find fun to play, the quest is tedious beyond belief, and the way that the map butchers the mystery of Mob of the Dead is absolutely criminal. Despite this, there were some surprising nuggets of greatness in here that I don't think I allowed myself to fully appreciate before. The theatrical feel of the map is unlike anything ever seen in Aether, the soundtrack is absolutely fantastic, and the ending, while it is plagued by Deus Ex Machina nonsense, still manages to retain a solid amount of emotional power. Well, that's all for today. I'd like to thank you all for watching, and hopefully, Cold War Zombies ends up being great, because I'd love to make some videos on that one. Have a wonderful day, everyone, and take care.
the